Started. Thanks everyone for coming to today's event called Yes, We Do Mean Smash the State. I'm Shireen and I'll be moderating this discussion. Today's event is organized by the Tempest Collective, which is an organization that folks can join if they like what we're about. The speaker today is Brian Bean, who's a Chicago-based socialist activist, a member of the Tempest Collective, an editor of Rampant magazine, and co-editor of the book Palestine, A Socialist Introduction. Brian will be speaking for just about 30 minutes, and then we'll open it up for discussion. If you want to go ahead, Brian, feel free to get started.
Cool. Thanks, Shireen. Thanks to folks who are here, and look forward to a good conversation and hope that what I have to say can bring out people's thoughts and promote that good conversation. So the socialist movement, I think in the United States, we're in a very sort of early position of it. Has taken on the question of like reform or revolution or reform and revolution in many different ways. And there's a whole bunch of different ramifications and conclusions that one draws from how you answer that. What kind of organization do we need? What is the relationship that socialists should have towards electoral politics and all that? And I think that behind that question, there is the question of the state and what socialists have to say about the state. And so I want to step back a little bit to talk about that question, because I think debates around the state set up how you engage all the other variations of strategy and tactics of how we envision socialism and how we get there. And so I think we need to combine our theorizing about like the immediate tasks that we have to take on with these big picture questions like socialist revolution in the state, because our goal isn't just winning the immediate wage increase or one mayoral state or closing this or that prison, but a radical reconstruction of all of society. So I would say that smashing the state, far from being a radical slogan that is ultra left or out of touch with reality, I think the notion of the need to smash the state represents the realistic starting point for thinking about the task of the transition to socialism. So that's kind of the provocation that I'll throw out. And to build on that, I'm basically going to do three things in this talk. The first is kind of give a description of what I think a Marxist analysis of what the state and states are. Talk a little bit about the notion of smashing, and then talking about some alternative arguments that have been made against that. So first, what is a state? So I would say that a state, or states, is an organized body of people that is charged with a monopoly. They're the ones in charge of doing it, of certain crucial social functions, making, enforcing, always through legitimated violence, rules, laws, etc. It's a combination of a bureaucracy, so you can think State Department, Treasury, Interior, Congress, etc., and that of armed force, Army, FBI, CIA, local police, etc. In most capitalist states, only a minute speck of those individuals are elected. And so although the individuals who are elected do play a role kind of adjusting the course, the basic kind of engine and trajectory of the state, what it's doing, I think, is inbuilt into the logic of what the state's function is and its relationship to capitalism. The modern capitalist state, as described in a famous line from the Communist Manifesto, is, quote, but a committee for managing the common affairs of the whole bourgeoisie, end quote. So managing these affairs means ensuring the smooth functioning of capitalism for the capitalist class of any given country or state. At the core of this, the management of capitalist order, the thing that does it is a special body of armed men, to use another famous phrase of Lenin. So these two elements, the monopoly of threat of overwhelming violence and the manager of capitalist interest, are the two basic operating principles of the capitalist state in general. I'm going to talk about each of these in time. So first, in thinking about this as a committee for common capitalist interest, it's important to note that this committee is not a literal committee. All the billionaires don't actually sit in one room and make decisions. And I say this without minimizing the massive influence the capitalist class exerts on the state. And people know that, the way the system runs on campaign contributions, the army of lobbyists, the revolving door of actual members of the ruling class who often serve in the state and all that. But even with that, it can't be said that the state is a simple tool or instrument that is immediately directed by all the billionaires sitting around in this hypothetical darkened room or committee. This is what's called the instrumentalist theory of the state, and some crude Marxist analysis make this error. The instrumentalist theory, as pointed out by radical sociologist Fred Bloch, misses two key features of the state. The first is that even if it does serve as a tool for class rule, it's got to appear otherwise. The fact that the bourgeois state appears as a neutral intermediary plays an important ideological function. This neutral appearance of the capitalist state is rooted in capitalist social relations, because in most circumstances, force or violence isn't needed to compel workers to go to work and produce. You would just starve. Political power is institutionally separate from the private sphere of exploitation, so instead it takes this form of a public or impersonal power that is standing above classes defined in production. But secondly, and most importantly, the general interest of capital is not always shared or known by the capitalists themselves. So what I mean by that is that capitalists as a class are not class conscious. So Jeff Bezos, for example, has his best interests in mind in trying to make the most profit for his own little slice of the pie. And this shapes his inability to know the best interests of the system of capitalism as a whole. Capitalism as a system is driven on the processes of exchange on the market, and this puts capitalists in competition with each other. The socialist Hal Draper said internally, capitalism is a snake pit. And this is why Marx and Engels referred to them as a hostile band of brothers. This is dramatically more the case when you begin to talk about imperialism. So capitalists are competing within nation states, but also capitalists through nation states compete on the international stage. Because of this competitive and crisis-prone nature of capitalism, sometimes the state has to act against the private interest of specific capitalists. They have to carry out price controls, restrictions on exports and the like, or even to aid the working class in order to quell class conflict. So think about how the New Deal was implemented out of fear of insurrection. So sometimes the state itself has to act against the interests of one specific section or sector of capitalism for the general business environment for the capitalist class as a whole to roll out. The states, or state managers specifically, often kind of develop their own special interests. This is what makes the capitalist state unique, makes it different from something like a monarchy, is that, to quote Engels, the capitalist state stands above society. However, it's important to note here that some reformists use this kind of critique of crude instrumentalism to say that, okay, well, if the state stands above society, if it has this so-called relative autonomy, and since there's these divisions in this non-class conscious capitalist class, that we can just grab hold of this state and use it as a tool for us to carry out our socialist transition. Now, I'll talk about why this is a wrong position later on. So states rely on tax revenue and borrowing to function. So tax revenue and borrowing depends on profitability of the system and a business climate that promotes investment. This becomes especially critical because during periods of economic crisis, and of course, capitalism is inherently crisis prone, moving in boom and bust cycles. When capitalism hits one of these bust cycles, state managers' job is to work to restart the capitalist economic engine and work to facilitate capitalist investment, as this is what largely determines the kind of overall level of economic activity. So the state then there at these points are always going to make pro-business decisions, which often carry out, of course, austerity and other horrible measures for the working class. Now, this is a bit of a simplification, but in a sense, states have to compete for the private decisions of capitalists to maintain themselves. And thus, the structural function of the state is to ensure the smooth, profitable functioning of the capitalist system in general, and specifically to manage a favorable business climate for the interests of the state's specific national capitalist class, all the capitalists who are associated with one specific nature state. And state managers are conscious of this fact. They know what their jobs are, and they know if they don't do their jobs, they'll be removed. Here I want to gesture to another element of competition, that is the competition between states. So capitalism doesn't create the state, but a system of states. It requires actually these bodies of capitalists from different areas, different physical places to be able to sort of interact and to carry out the cutthroat world of the market internationally, where capitalists are in competition and competition breeds crisis. And so there's something that needs to have a degree of independence to facilitate market order horizontally within the state and to carry out the club law of the capitalists between states internationally. So the use of violence and managing of the state happens within the state and internationally as well. And so, like I said, for the state maintaining this market order, it requires an organization of violent force. Having that viable business climate for investment means that a monopolization of what can be called legitimate violence has to be secured to ensure that order is maintained. So cops beat the protesters, mass incarcerations devised to thwart Black rebellion, tanks roll through the streets to quell uprisings, bombs, troops, infinite war abroad to maintain hegemony. All these things are carried out by this special body of armed men to fulfill a key social function of capitalist order. And for our purposes, I want to just underscore this component of the state as being its keystone. If what I said previously about what drives the state to act in capitalist interest, the thing that enables it to act is its capacity for violence. And this centrality is unchanged, even though since the writings of people like Marx and Engels and Lenin, layers have been added to the state. It's more bureaucratic, more complex. There's some iterations of welfare functions that have been added post-World War II. All these things are in place, but at its core, it's still special bodies of armed men. And I think some of those who argue for a more reformist position on the state, that saying that the state is only a welfare state, often will confuse this increase and expanded complexity of the contemporary state with an alteration of its violent core. And I think that's a profound error. And there's many ways you can look at that. So one, the budgets, which of course come from workers' tax dollars on both the federal and local level, still devote from a third to over half on these armed men. And you can also look at relative sizes. The Department of Labor, for example, has 17,000 employees. Department of Education, 4,000 employees. In comparison, there's 12,000 congressional lobbyists. And the size of the entire non-military federal workforce is 2 million. 700,000, which is about 35% of these, are civilians working for the Department of Defense. The military numbers 1.4 million individuals. So overall, the Department of Defense is the largest employer in the world. And you can look at this locally too. Local police forces often make up huge components of the municipal state. Roughly 40% of the city of Chicago's employees are cops. So purely from the stance of raw numbers, the special body of armed men description still figures centrally. And it's this murderous leviathan, its reason for being is to be deployed to institute this capitalist order, defend the state and private property, and carry out aggression and intimidation internationally. So the state structurally plays this role of instituting, maintaining capitalist order, attempting to generalize the working of the capitalist system, and welding a monopoly of violent force to ensure its rule remains. So it's not a neutral tool by any means, but a special organization that is historically developed for one sole purpose. And so in talking about its purpose, I want to talk about how we oppose it. And so talking about smashing the state. So the phrase "to smash the state" probably was popularized by Lenin in State and Revolution. Folks have read that. And that comes from Marx and the lessons that he and Engels gleaned from the Paris Commune. So Paris Commune, 1871, midst of a massive political crisis and war, the workers of Paris rose up, took control of the city, and engaged in an experiment of democratic self-rule for roughly 3 months. So rather than laying hold of the pre-existing political structures, they replaced them and radically recreated structures from below in attempts not to change the governmental personnel, but to remake society anew. And so in April, as this was going on, Marx in a letter wrote that he had learned that what was, quote, essential for real people's revolution was not, quote, to transfer the bureaucratic military machine from one hand to another, but to smash it. In this lesson of the Commune, he would figure into the later preface of the Communist Manifesto, where they said the one thing they needed to update about the manifesto was that, quote, the working class cannot simply lay hold of the ready-made state machinery and weld it to their own purposes. So Marx, who also wrote the most useful thing the state could do would be to commit suicide, and Engels, who opined that he looked forward to the day that the state would sit in the Museum of Antiquity next to no other no longer used tools, were both quite clear that the transformation to a socialist society would require a revolution against the state with the goal of abolition. And so this kind of drastic conclusion is necessary because socialism, for each according to their needs and by each according to their ability, is the only possible actual democracy. So why is what we live in not really a democracy in that same way? So under bourgeois democracy, politics is almost completely divorced from daily life. We, of course, have the right to vote, some of us, in federal and local races, but we do so in an atomized form, in isolation from any community, via secret ballot, in most cases disconnected from political discussion or any actual collective decision-making. And this is, of course, independent of all the ways that the vote is rigged via voter disenfranchisement, gerrymandering, money in politics, problem of the two-party system, and a list that can go on and on. But then after you vote someone in office, we have no real mandate over their activity. On the federal level, there's no way to recall someone and exert control of them. Then the majority of elections are for legislature, which handles the general case of laws, while the business of states, what they do, is very concerned with generalities, but they're concerned with specifics. So all the details of what the state manager of different departments do is divorced from what any of us have to say about, like, for example, what education should look like, or all the numerous international summits that are convened all around the world that make major international decisions about war, economics, and crucially, climate catastrophe. So all these summits, these G8, 9, 10, 11, 12 meetings make huge geopolitical decisions that most people have no real say in. On top of that, the vast majority of the state is not elected at all, and we have next to no control. And importantly, that includes the repressive apparatuses of the army and the police. And so lastly, and I think this is actually most importantly, in the place where we spend the majority of our waking time at work, we usually have absolutely no democracy. We have no control of our workplaces, though maybe if you're lucky enough to have a union that's not shit, you can negotiate over the terms of your exploitation. So instituting democratic determination over our world, our labor, and the fruits thereof require a completely different type of social organization than the capitalist state. The capitalist state, in the form of bourgeois democracy, which is the form in most of the dominant capitalist countries, was considered by Marx and company as the most stable form of government for capitalism, precisely because the illusion of democratic control. Straight up military dictatorships are firstly expensive to maintain and historically notoriously brittle, as there's little ideological cover that can serve as a buffer of class anger. Ryan. 15, great, and state violence. But to quote Lenin, bourgeois democracy, although a great historical advance in comparison with medievalism, always remains, and under capitalism is bound to remain, restricted, truncated, false and hypocritical, a paradise for the rich and a snare and deception for the exploited. The fact that it is more democratic than feudalism or dictatorship doesn't mean that the democracy afforded can deliver liberation, hence the snare. And so we want something different, and that requires this breaking apart of the state. And the kind of smashing of the state, the breaking apart of it, I wouldn't describe as purely a destructive act. It's not as though we just tear something down and then we figure it out. Abolition, as Ruth Wilson Gilmore tells us, is about presence, not absence. It's about building life-affirming institutions. And so we get to these life-affirming institutions by replacing the state with its charade of representative democracy with organs of direct democracy and self-government. And this is why the state is a hurdle to the creative act of social transformation. The state maintains its rule and its place above society and its use of violence to secure that place and maintain capitalist order. Self-government is the antithesis of that. The Russian revolutionary Leon Trotsky wrote that the most indubitable feature of the revolution is the direct interference of the masses in historical events. The entry of masses of people into their own self-government means breaking apart the channels that previously constrained the choice and self-determination. The direct control from below looks very different than a repurposing of the current state. The bourgeois state is premised on divorcing power and politics from the masses. We want to bring all the power to the masses. We don't want the right people in the Department of Education. We want teachers in democratic control of our schools. We don't want union-friendly bureaucrats in control of the Department of Labor. We want worker control of production. We don't want control of the police. We want them abolished, jails leveled, borders opened. This may seem like a chaotic process, but for it to work, it has to actually be one that requires a great deal of organization and combativity of our class. And that is precisely why this action of breaking apart is one that is tremendously creative. And we see snippets of this creativity arise in periods of mass struggle, where we see protest tactics and organizational forms, such as mutual aid that sprung up during the pandemic and the protest waves that surged forward in 2020, councils and assemblies that have bloomed in public life during mass struggle can be seen as the forms that manage society. And there's scores of examples in history of ways in which mass struggles around immediate demands blossoming into experiments and councils and committees and organs of mass control of society. You know, we have Russia in 1917, Germany 1918, Spain, Hungary, Shanghai, Poland. The list goes on, and we can talk about examples if we want to. But I think as its basis, socialists should know that ordinary people are capable of organizing to meet our own needs because working people are already doing it in their workplaces and their communities. Imagine if our mutual aid groups, strike councils, seized workplaces, neighborhood committees, and popular assemblies were all organized on such a scale that they could take up the functioning of all of society. So reaching that powerful height, a situation sometimes described as dual power, brings the question of power, of who actually rules, onto the table. But dual power itself is not the goal. The goal is to be organized enough to be able to resolve the question of power by smashing and replacing the state. That kind of organization can only be built through mass participation and lived struggle. The political education provided by collective action, politically, theoretically, and ideologically, is crucial. And for masses of ordinary people, wrote Lenin, only struggle discloses to it the magnitude of its power, widens its horizon, enhances its abilities, clarifies its mind, and forges its will. So struggle is the preparation for self-rule. And with this, the capitalist state will be a key hurdle, and its abolition then is the precondition for enacting a socialist transformation from below. So last part of my talk, I want to talk about some of the other arguments that people make against the conception of smashing the state that I laid out. The first thing is the common sense of this position that I'm going to call utopian incrementalism is that socialism changes by doing the following. First, we build movements for reforms with broad appeal and the idea that they're building broad support for socialism. Usually, these reforms are designed about some kind of legislation, often written by an NGO or a lobbyist organization to try to get it passed through Congress. The best versions of this position are clear that we do want to build a mass movement, but they see it, the self-activity of people in struggle as secondary. It's only a pressure tool that applies pressure through demonstrations and the like to try to get the legislation passed. The point of this campaign is utilized then to get socialist politicians elected. And advocates of this position see getting them elected as the real wins and gains of the movement. So shortcuts like running them in capitalist political parties are utilized. So the goal for them is to incrementally accumulate electoral victories in order to win a majority in Congress. Then the socialist movement can perhaps try to make moves to nationalize key industries. The worst of these positions believes a fantasy story that socialist laws can be passed that will change the institutional structure of capitalism, and that out of respect for the legality of the state, the army and the police and the CIA just go along with it. The capitalists are outfoxed, and voila, we have socialism. But that's a pure reformism, in that it believes that the capitalist mode of production can be fixed within. There's a more savvy of these positions that's articulated by people who like 20th century German socialist Karl Kautsky and is repeated fairly dogmatically across this line. So people like Kautsky sometimes allude that there may be some kind of final test of strength in which this hypothetical socialist majority government is then the capitalist class tries to stop them. Presumably, this is a mass defense of a capitalist-led coup of this hypothetical socialist majority government. The problem being is that this kind of final test of strength is always ill-defined. Revolution for them is not on the agenda anytime soon, so they say, let's not even talk about it. And there are two main critiques of this position. The first is that it's gradualism, and the second is in the question of revolution. The structure of the state, relying on taxes and investment, as I've described before, means that the question of crisis always figures into the struggle for reforms. When capitalism is booming, reforms are easier to apply. When capitalism is in economic downturn, then that places immense pressure on the rolling back of reforms in an attempt to stimulate capitalist investment. This puts this hypothetical majority socialist government in a tremendous bind. Do they restrain and demobilize their supporters, to stop their hopes and demands when they try to strike and protest to preserve what they have? Or do they promote further radicalization, thus provoking direct confrontation with the capitalist class? So this conundrum, this contradiction, unfortunately, has a track record. And the track record of this type of experiment using the state is tremendously poor. Past attempts have always taken the restraint option, as the direct confrontation would actually entail rupture of the state. And I won't get into the specifics, but we could talk about France in 1936, Chile in 1973, France in 1981, the trajectory of Sweden, Greece in 2015, over and over and over and over. So in short, though, this dilemma is that to challenge the pursuit of profit makes reform impossible, but to leave profit unchallenged means that no significant progress can be made towards equality. That kind of describes this contradiction. So the alternative to this conundrum would be if there was a move to upend the capitalist social relation, but that means upending private property. And that path is not one that can be carried out within the bounds of legality within the state. The state in the capitalist context relies on capitalist social relations, and even if it has a reformist government who seeks to try to redistribute things more equally, it's still based on those relations. The problem of capitalism isn't a problem of distribution, but the social relation of private property, held by the few, forcing the many to trade their labor on the market in order to not survive. So this is why there's a limit to all attempts of nationalization through the legal courses of the state, and why so many attempts to carry this out are either met with capital flight, that is take their money
You've been speaking
or,
for 25 minutes, sorry.
Great, wait it out, or violent coups in which the state is dissolved or taken over by forces friendlier to the capitalists. So now I want to talk about the question of revolution. So utopian incrementalists sequester the question of revolution as somehow being less relevant because it's not on the immediate agenda. And while that is probably true, it's naive in that it underestimates its eventual crucial importance, or it's dishonest in which they actually don't think revolution is possible or desirable. So to paraphrase a comrade of mine, if a goal like revolution is desirable and feasible in the long run, but impossible to achieve in the short run, it seems extremely unwise to push it to the side and dismiss it as irrelevant to those organizing in the here and now, especially if our idea is that we want to win everyone, all the working class, to the notion that we need this kind of revolution. So it's not just unwise to avoid this question, but it's disastrous. Counter-revolution has been a predictable historical reaction in any country where a left-wing movement has made serious inroads towards reshaping the economy and against the existing political power structures. State bodies like the CIA and the military brass aren't neutral actors, and the bounds of legality will not protect movements and individuals from counter-revolutionary backlash intent on defending the fundamental interests of capital. The sheer size and development of the contemporary state's military wings means that any socialist project will confront massive challenges to being realized. But to shrink from the challenges because they're too large does nothing to actually prepare for overcoming the obstacles we know are an inevitable response to successfully implementing a project of liberation. But fortunately, that daunting obstacle isn't something we must confront alone. As we don't want to. No sort of guerrilla-style armed struggle has any hope of success in a military campaign against the repressive state in this country right now, and that's not what the revolution would rely on. Instead, any revolutionary process involves masses of people, and the source of the movement's power is its ability to shut down society through workplace strikes, street mobilizations, and protecting ourselves in our communities. Defending the gains made by socialist or abolitionist movement, our own sides, institutions, and communities will also mean self-defense, perhaps armed sometimes, against ruling class backlash and targeted repression. Counter-revolution will be not defeated without destroying the means for counter-revolution to be carried out. So doing that means breaking apart the state, the repressive apparatus, this violent core that's essential, and seizing the means of production. These tasks can only be called socialist revolution, and it cannot be accompanied by any respect for private property or servility to bourgeois legality. So if we're serious about building life beyond capitalism, we can't avoid these kinds of tough questions. We have to take responsibility for the future of the movement. If we're building a socialist movement and an organization of revolutionaries, politically and organizationally unprepared for these moments of backlash, these high levels of struggle, then we're setting up a generational effort for certain failure. And so being prepared for these heights of struggle have profound implications for our tasks in the here and now and how we conduct ourselves in the immediate struggle for reforms. Do we organize on the premise that gradual changes in the state structure are the path to winning socialism? Or do we see the need to organize in opposition to the state? Even if we put forward socialist candidates, for example, to be a megaphone of social movements, do we anticipate moments of crisis, sparks of outrage and antagonism, and try to develop them into windows of opportunity? A revolutionary strategy would attempt to always and everywhere kindle the conflagration, understanding the best terrain for waging the class struggle is not in the marble sanctums of parliaments, but in the disruptive, sometimes illegal activity of strikes, mass demonstrations, uprisings, and civil disobedience. To kind of close out, I want to take on one more common charge. So another common charge made by utopian incrementalists is that bourgeois democracy has legitimacy for the vast majority of working people. Parliaments, they say, are gains won by working people and thus should be defended. And I think the first thing to say about that is it's a wild historical inaccuracy. While universal suffrage, the right to vote, was a demand won by the working class, parliaments were not. And that aside, there's still a challenge that needs to be overcome and not adapted to. People do have illusions in sort of the bourgeois state, but this is the basis of reformism. And the fact that the state, out of its function to moderate class conflict, is created by these contradictions of capitalism, has been the mechanism through which workers have made gains, is, like I said, the material basis for the illusions of modern reformism. But that's a challenge to be overcome. But even modern reformism has contradictions. So the very notion that bourgeois democracy is legitimated in the eyes of the working class is not so simple when you look at the approval ratings of Congress, which is 7%. If you look at how confidence level in all political institutions are historic low based on Gallup polls. If you look at the waves of demonstrations you see across the globe, if you remember the anti-racist rebellion against George Floyd, if you remember how in 2020, a majority of Americans were in favor of burning down of a Minneapolis police station, more so than the presidential candidates of the two parties. Several comprehensive studies of trends in worldwide social movements from 2006 to 2020 found that these global protests have increased and increased and increased, that they've moved from single issue demands to omnibus protests that are against the political and economic system. Polls show worldwide related dissatisfaction with democracies and lack of trust in governments. And so compare that, this sort of general disaffection, with one socialist argument in Jacobin that said, quote, "The overwhelming historic experience is that, whether we like it or not, working people will try to use the existing institutions of political democracy under capitalism to further their interests and to transform society," end quote. I think it's nonsense to argue that with this global trend and massive demonstrations of marches of millions, of pushing back police, building barricades, look what's happening in France, of self-sacrificing riot, hurling back rocks and tear gas canisters, braving nights of smoke and fire, that all that can be described as, quote unquote, using the existing institutions of political democracy. So rather, working class consciousness is contradictory. The politics of reformism are still dominant, even while people are also dissatisfied, disgruntled, and raging against it. So in this equation, the legitimacy of reformism in the state isn't a fixed reality to be catered to, but a challenge to be overcome. So in this context, I think we ask ourselves how we as revolutionaries approach the work of building movements. Do we stoke support for liberal democracy and the status quo and reinforce the legitimacy of the system? Or do we try to fuel the fire of intense dissatisfaction and say, yes, the system is rotten, it cannot save you, and it has to be abolished? Our hope lies unshakably in the tremendous creativity of people in struggle. What seemed impossible yesterday can rapidly shift to be considered what is necessary today. Nowhere is this process more crucial than the question of capitalist states. The historically grounded need to smash the state to achieve liberation, can it be reduced to an intellectual abstraction or a chic radical shibboleth? Smashing the state is, rather, the only realistic approach of a serious revolutionary project. The existence of the capitalist state is incompatible with the development of socialism. So to prepare a revolutionary socialist movement to be fit for its historic task, we need clarity among the militant workers, activists, and rebels involved in the fights of today. Sharp political crises, struggle and revolutionary situations are inevitable under capitalism, but our side's victory is not. The possibility for a liberated future will only be built from the rubble of capitalist states.